Now, how the hell did I end up down the borderline personality disorder rabbit hole so late in my life? Stick around, boys and girls. It's quite a story. Hey kids, straight talking Fedora Chick coming at you, and welcome to the channel. If you are near here, I talk about social issues of the day, namely mental health topics, but not exclusively. Issues I feel strongly about. I do this through Storytime blogs that have much data and studies attached and some response videos. Basically, my little rant corner of the intertubes. If you are interested in this type of content, please consider subscribing and hit the ringy-dingy icon below so you can be notified every time I upload. In today's video, I will talk about how I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder for 4 years or so late in life, and a brief overview of what led to that point. Now, I am not going to do too much of a detailed video. It will cover briefly what I went through in this from the summer of 2014 all the way to the spring of 2017 approximately. I will be speaking exclusively about how the parade of professionals all those years got me wrong for the most part. This video will also serve as a precursor to future videos later down the road that one can refer to. Who to believe, who to believe? A psychiatrist who followed me from my late teens to my late 30s for a grand total of two whole decades? Or a parade of doctors, psychiatrists who saw me no more than once or twice late in my life? You'd be surprised at who I believed, at least initially, but changed my mind later. I will explain this shortly. For openers, borderline personality, BPD for short, not to be mistaken with bipolar disorder, is usually diagnosed at a very young age. Teenagers to young adults, mainly women and girls in their 20s. It's rare that a person over the age of 40 would be diagnosed freshly with BPD for the first time in their lives. It does happen. In fact, one of the women in my group back in 2015 was past 50, and 2 were in their mid to late 30s, but the rest were really quite young. Now, I'm not going to go over the basic symptoms as there are enough videos on YouTube to cover that, and there's more than enough on the net. Some correct, many incorrect. A diagnosis of BPD is like being diagnosed with schizophrenia. I have found many of these labels, if anything, have divided even those with mental health issues, like bad disorders and good disorders, for lack of a better term. It's quite divisive. And how is one to remove the stigma of mental health if this is so divisive? While there is still a stigma on the subject of mental health as a whole, I would say that BPD and schizophrenia and others like it get the brunt of it, even further ostracized. Now, I'm not going to dwell on schizophrenia today, as that is a subject I'm not really well versed in. I do hope one day to have someone collab with me here on this channel who either has the diagnosis of schizophrenia or is close to somebody with schizophrenia. I have no idea who yet. We'll let you know if and when that time comes. I'm not saying I am an authority on the subject of BPD. Far from it. I would have to either be a licensed therapist, which I'm not. I don't even play one on radio. But I can speak as a lifelong patient of the mental health industry. Yes, kids, make no mistake, it is an industry. Although I would say more so in the United States where there is no universal health care. Anyhow, onward. I somehow unwittingly ended up down that rabbit hole beginning in the summer of 2014. Just a little background before I get into that. I had been in and out of psychiatrists, psychologists, and other therapists of varying stripes on and off since I was a toddler. Yes, kids, you heard that right. I was a toddler. I do plan to do a video on that very subject, and I'm working on that script as I speak. My first foray with psychiatrists and therapists of varying stripes began before age 2. Dr. Fred was probably the most significant in my life. It's not his real name. Protecting his privacy, he's retired now. He came into my life when I was 17, still a minor. He was primarily a pediatric psychiatrist, but continued to see many of his patients he saw as kids when they aged out, which was a rarity. When a kid turns 18, they usually have to move to services for adults and have to see someone, of course, who specializes with, well, adulting. If Dr. Fred, by some stretch of the imagination, sees this video, I'm reasonably certain he would know I'm talking about him. Oh, he ran amok of all kinds of bureaucratic rules and other such crap. But I think that's what made him great. In fact, I started writing a novel, fiction, but based loosely on my own coming of age, bunch of events coming together, and it's a tribute to him. It's been shelved. What else is new? I say this only to illustrate how much respect I had for the man. He was unorthodox by standards back then, which the standards were a little more lax, not by much, slightly back in those days. So imagine today with even dumber and tighter bureaucratic rules where terms like eccentric to the mission are written into the laws of healthcare here in La Belle Province. But unorthodox always worked best by me. I'm off the beaten path myself, quirky, so mainstream cookie cutters of any stripe were and are not relatable to me. Many of us called him by his first name, which was cool. No airs of superiority like many doctors or therapists of any stripe would have. He saw me for nearly 2 decades. He retired the last year I saw him. I was about 36 or 37 then. My file was never transferred to anybody else for continuity, but by that time, other than a burnout that took me off my job then as a taxi dispatcher, I was okay. I was stable. Not great, but okay. And okay is about as good as it gets in the world according to Straight Talkin Fedora Chic. So I didn't really do anything to seek out a replacement for Dr. Fred. Felt no need for it, or perhaps just couldn't be bothered with the bureaucracy in this province. I did have a few meetings with the odd therapist, counselor of different stripes, social workers, stopgap measures when I was in crisis, but nothing more. That was until the summer of 2014. Just to be clear here, Dr. Fred did not believe in labeling his patients. If he had to sign forms for disability benefits of any stripes or a letter stipulating a patient's fitness to work, as many employers here do require this when they're going through the hiring process, he would assign a diagnosis listed in the DSM of the day. In my case, it was severe depression, generalized anxiety, learning disabilities. Well, that I always knew. I am dyslexic, so no surprises there. And PTSD, what we know, post-traumatic stress disorder. That was the official skinny on me for the better part of 2 decades. I had no problem believing any of that. I had done the research. I had the symptoms in spades. Still do. Sometimes we know ourselves best, right? After all, it's who we live with 24/7. Think about that one. But otherwise, Dr. Fred never liked to label anyone, and today I look back and think that was, and probably still is, a good thing. And that might remove much of the stigma facing mental health or mental illness. Fast forward to mid-June 2014, following almost a year of shit happening nonstop in my personal and work life. It never stopped. One bad thing after the other. I am not going to get into those events in this video, but a longer video with a more detailed timeline will be uploaded in the next few days. It was an important year for so many reasons. Let's just say that shit show known as 2013, 2014 was more than just a rough year. This chain of events precipitated another chain of events that led me to my retirement, which is very significant. Fast forward to July 2014, as mentioned. I have the first full psych assessment since I was a teenager done by a psychiatrist, referred to as Dr. P, referred by my family doctor, who we'll call Dr. Z. It spanned 2 hours over 2 different appointments. Much interviewing had to pass that stupid mocha test. I wish it was about coffee drinks, kids. Oh no. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which I failed and would continue taking that stupid test over and over again and never doing well at it. It would be a source of frustration throughout the years to come. For those who don't know, the MOCA, or Montreal Cognitive Assessment, is a test of, cognitive functioning, memory, verbal, image recognition, having to draw certain things, etc. I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what exactly this test looks like in this video, maybe another time. I also passed other tests prior to the appointments, the Beck's Depression Inventory, the Beck's Anxiety Inventory, and one other that I really can't remember. Must not really be all that significant, I guess. The second day of assessments led with Dr. P. He looked at a report from the psych ER at a hospital far away on the island of Montreal, the hospital where Dr. Fred worked at. I had forgotten I had a visit over there. I can't really remember going at all to this day, let alone remember why. It had taken place about a decade before that fateful July of 2014. Anyway, that psych emerge visit was shortly before Dr. Fred's retirement. Dr. P read off that report and told me that the psychiatrist on duty that day wrote that I had borderline personality disorder. Well, needless to say, I was shocked and horrified. Here I am, a 40-something. I was in complete shock and disbelief. Like, how could this have been missed after all the years? A decade ago. No one told me about that. Like I said, I forgot about that visit. I would remember something like BPD, if that's what the doctor on duty really thought. I knew what it was through my work, or at least the basics of it. I never thought of BPD otherwise except within the context of work. Dr. Fred most certainly never told me of that. Though in fairness, I can't recall if I did have an appointment following that ER visit or not. Even then, Dr. Fred knew me best. He watched me grow from an antisocial adolescent right into morose adulthood. As mentioned at the top of this video, BPD is mostly caught when a patient is young. I was well into my 30s. Most of all, again, that psychiatrist on duty that day did not tell me I had BPD. Something would have triggered such a memory. So no one saw fit to tell me. I remember having a full-on panic attack in Dr. P's office. I had no idea. I didn't know what to think. I knew this was one of the bad labels to have. The thoughts raced through my mind a mile a minute. I couldn't catch my breath. I couldn't hang on to an idea or a thought for longer than maybe 5 seconds. I ended up numb and dizzy. Once again, I gained some semblance of composure. He told me he was referring me to the personality disorders clinic at the Allen Memorial. Oh yes, here I have no trouble dropping a bunch of names. I am not pretending for that party. I am not protecting them. They need to be held to account. Then I thought to myself, about that scene in the 1999 movie Girl Interrupted. Winona Ryder's character, Susanna Kaysen, saying, borderline? Between what and what? Borderline between Canada and the US? It's always been my little joke. I would learn later through my own research that borderline and borderline personality disorder referred to being between neuroses and psychoses. It should often be noted that more often than not, BPD comes with comorbid conditions attached, such as anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as a whole range of other conditions. I mentioned those three in particular because the typical treatment for BPD is DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, something created by psychologist Marsha Linehan in 1993. It has been said that Linehan has BPD as well. Not sure of the veracity of that though, and I'm not talking about that any further in this video anyway. All I see is that someone who raked in so much coin from the copyright from that DBT workbook and program outline. Ka-ching! It should be noted, something not noted in those vlogs and blogs about DBT. It is not effective with the three conditions I mentioned earlier in this video: depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Once more with feeling, some of the most common comorbid conditions attached to BPD. Yes, I did my homework on this. I always do my homework. He was referring me for an assessment with veteran psychiatrist Dr. Joel Paris. After much research, I ascertained that he was one of Montreal's, if not North America's, foremost experts in personality disorders, or so he is deemed. I also saw much of what he said or what he wrote. One thing that kept harping on was that too many professionals were afraid of diagnosing personality disorders. He also didn't really believe in diagnosing kids with Asperger's or anything on the autism spectrum. I'm not going to speculate on the latter. Again, I am not that well versed. Besides, I'm not a licensed therapist or a doctor. So, like so many others in the psychiatric professional community, he does not believe that ADHD is an actual condition. Nor does he believe in multiple personality disorder. I believe there is another name for that these days, but I forget what it is. Perhaps he should read Judy Rebick's book, a well-known feminist and pro-choicer here in Canada, a heroine to many, for those who don't know. Anyways, I'm not going on with that argument. Yes, as I said, perhaps he should read Judy Rebick's last book, Heroes in My Head. But that's another discussion for another time. In other words, it would appear that everything is personality disorders, or more specifically, everything is borderline personality disorder in the world, according to the great Dr. Joel Paris. Nonetheless, I saw him. He didn't ask too many questions. He concentrated mainly on Dr. P's report. He did not ask any questions that were not mentioned in that rather long report. Yes, heaven forbid he should try to actually get to know me and come to his own conclusions, right? I didn't think of that at the time, and I probably should have, but I was still in pretty bad shape, recovering from a major breakdown I suffered in the June of that year. Yes, he may have the fancy degrees, the clout, the status, but even he needs to be held to account and should be challenged, right? He diagnosed me exclusively with BPD, none of the comorbid conditions, none of the other diagnoses that Dr. P gave in addition to BPD. His bedside manner of sorts really did suck. I was none too happy with that. Again, he wasn't paying attention. Ever hear of actually getting to know the patient you're assessing? Once again, with feeling. Nah, pish, that would require critical thinking. something not nearly enough of us do to this day. He referred me for the long-term program, a program that goes up to a year. It was adapted from DBT in the sense that there was the individual sessions once per week, as well as a group going through Line of Hands workbook. Anybody here? Ka-ching! Once again, boys and girls. In addition, there was another group program called Progress Group. To this day, I still don't know what that means. I never felt any progress happening. Hell, you just didn't feel the love. So, 2 group sessions and 1 individual session per week. But there was a waiting list to get in, and I was on it. I was curious about the program, but at the same time dreaded it. A month later, I was summoned by my employer's HR doctor, standard for those who are going on sick leave for longer than 5 weeks, with some rare exceptions. She was okay with me. Her report indicated, again, that I had BPD, but to be fair, she was a GP, not a psychiatrist or even a neurologist. I would later learn that besides Dr. Zed, my GP, she was the only decent doctor I saw through the whole parade of professionals I saw. But kids, do you see a pattern here? This looks much like a game of follow the leader or monkey see, monkey do here. How does this help patients? I had another assessment with a Dr. F, who ran the particular program I went into. There were others in the room, and I was not comfortable with that. I felt that an ambush was about to happen. I had no reserve still to fight that off. I unfortunately wasn't wrong, except the others in the room did not speak. He did most of the talking. It was 2 hours of him and his minions asking me silly questions, repeating questions I couldn't really answer or didn't understand. I ended up getting accepted to the program with reluctance, and now that I look back, in my informed opinion, they only took me in because I had an employer's doctor who likely would have been breathing down their necks. If I wasn't employed or had no follow-up whatsoever with a doctor hired by my employer, I probably would have been refused. I might have refused too. Hey, the only thing that we might have agreed on. I started looking forward to the program though. Despite the fact that I don't function well in groups, I thought I could at least find some kindred spirits. Some who have been there where I have been, or dang close to it. Didn't work out that way. I'm not going to go into too much detail. This video is going to be already a lot longer than I would have liked. I do have 2 videos that were done over a year ago on that very subject, when this channel was still Fedora hippies. I must apologize in advance. At that time, I was learning the very basics of creating and editing videos, and as such, the editing is kind of crude. I do, however, plan to make a better and more condensed video of my experience with that so-called DBT program that will be better edited and thus more watchable. Is that even a word? Anyway, part 1 of that old video is in the info card above, if anyone is interested. Anyways, back to the topic at hand. The worst was I had actually started believing all those strangers over Dr. Fred. Did I really have BPD and Dr. Fred simply missed it? A lesson to be learned. The only professional who really ever had my back was Dr. Fred, and I would only come to have a greater appreciation of that later as the program progressed and the more that I found out. I started really having misgivings about the BPD diagnosis, especially when in groups. We were often described as manipulative, behaviors being manipulative. I didn't like that characteristic neither. Maybe it was the case for the other women in the group. I didn't really get to know them other than observing them within the group. But I am not manipulative. I really am not. I am not even good at it, even if I tried. And to go and harp by manipulation as being a mainstay of BPD, then we might as well throw in the salespeople, marketing people, public relations people, politicians, etc. into that borderline personality category. After all, people who work in these professions have to be manipulative on some level if they are to succeed at their respective professions. It was oversimplified. Oh, yes, there were the other symptoms with the emotional dysregulation. Yes, we often get too hysterical. Can't have that, ladies. I think the clincher came to me when I read an old article in the Montreal Gazette that the great Dr. Joel Paris testified for the Crown prosecution in the Luca Magnotta case. In fact, that revelation brought me to no shortage of anxiety, panic, and grief. People find all kinds of reasons to hate and disregard people like myself, as it is. We're ostracized enough as it is. I certainly did not want to be lumped with diabolical murderers like Magnotta. That case made the media worldwide, so I won't go into the case itself in this video. Anyway, Dr. Paris, amongst other psychiatrists who diagnosed Magnotta with schizophrenia, being what he is, being the great Dr. Joel Paris, testified that Magnotta had borderline personality disorder. Well, of course he would. It confirmed to me what I already suspected. The man thinks everybody off the beaten path, extra sensitive, or just plain different nonconformist, or somebody who is this diabolical in the case of Magnotta, has a borderline personality disorder, or at least a personality disorder of some stripe. I will say this though, Miss Alana, aka Barbie doll shrink, was completely unrelatable. Told me early in the program, though, that she did not believe I had BPD. Said basically that while I had some traits of it, then again, much of the symptomology of BPD also overlaps into other conditions such as bipolar disorder, including those all too common comorbid conditions that are attached. Well, I'll give her points for temporarily thinking outside the box. Really a landmark moment, because that would never happen again. I was discharged from the program in June of 2015. They found it was not helpful to me. Well, no kidding. And of course, instead of admitting their own failures, and let's face it, they did fail, and it's probably not the first time they fail, not that they would admit as much, and I was probably not the last patient they failed with. Anyways, they put the entire blame on me according to the exit report. I should add that the telltale of them not willing to admit their own failures or to be held to account, they made many superficial, cheap shots in it, like a crack about my weight and the way I dressed. Almost verbatim, an oddly dressed obese woman. Classy with a K. Also hypocritical, considering Dr. F, who signed off on the report if he didn't write it completely, was morbidly obese himself. Anyway, I'm getting off track. I'm merely pointing out one of the many hypocrisies I encountered. Fast forward to September 2015. I was summoned to a psychiatrist, an independent expert hired by my employer to assess me, a Dr. R. Again, he didn't ask the different questions that were already asked of me by others preceding him. Oh, why would he? He looked like he was tired of being there anyway and didn't really want to be there. But that was my impression. Anyways, in his report, again, the dreaded BPD label. I thought to myself, this is many levels of effed up. None of these professionals questioned Dr. Fred's reports or what he diagnosed me with or the fact that he never diagnosed me with BPD. Dr. Fred, who saw me for 2 decades, my 20s, my entire decade of in my 20s, when usually these illnesses finally manifest themselves. With the exception of Dr. Joel Paris, most of these professionals who diagnosed me with BPD were young enough to be Dr. Fred's grandchildren. They all only saw me once or twice. None actually attempted to get to know me. They relied heavily on reports written by professionals before them. As mentioned, more of a game of monkey see, monkey do. Yes, I get that it's not their job to get to know me. They're only assessing me and thus following reports. But here's something for a complete assessment. I don't know. What about asking questions that are not indicated in the reports or the literature that you have on hand? Hey, that's wild and crazy enough that it might work, right? But what do I know? That diagnosis, or rather that label on me, wore on me like an albatross, even though I never felt that it was right. The diagnosis was lifted finally in 2017 by a neurologist who was referred to for increasing short-term memory and word loss, issues with speech and such. My issues were mainly neurological at this time. I think it was the first time I felt validated somewhat. This new diagnosis is not a consolation prize by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I have a rough road ahead of me, so it's not something I wish on anybody. No, I'm not going to talk about that today. Well, that's just about going to do it for this video. Please like and subscribe and hit the ringy-dingy icon below so you can receive notifications every time I upload. Take care of yourselves and each other. Remember an important lesson here. Following the crowd for the sake of following the crowd, as the parade of pros seem to have done with me, can be problematic at best, perilous at worst. Straight talking Fedora Chic over and out.